officially started, as has the stream. All right, well, hi, welcome, happy Friday. My name's Ralph Nyberg. I have a limited amount of time, so I'm probably going to go fairly quickly and assume most of you guys sort of know me already. But this is a short presentation on a book called Evidence-Based Training Methods, and it focuses on, the science associated with learning and what does the science show, and possibly how we can apply that to our own personal practice. I mean, what I feel like is, instead of going through a full overview of the book, I thought I would just sort of address the first 3 chapters, and if things go well, if people like it, then we can, do more chapters as we go with these various meetings. So let me go ahead and get my presentation up here while we're here. And again, I'm trying to keep this condensed and not put too much cognitive load on you guys in terms of the content that we're going to cover in this particular class. So 3 things to look at here. Talk a little bit about training myths, also how we use visuals or graphics in our presentation, and then also cognitive load. And so again, what I tried to do is come up with a way to talk about the particular topic, and then also give you a potential takeaway for your particular classroom. And I do highly recommend the book. I mean, I think you will enjoy it if you give it a read. So first myth here is there's no evidence to correlate learning styles and actual learning. So the idea here is that, we spend a lot of time talking about visual learners, or I'm a hands-on learner and things like that. And the truth is, the science behind that, and they've done a fair number of studies, is that people who qualify, or people who classify themselves as visual learners, often test to be of a different type. And when you give them educational material and then you measure learning, they cannot come up with any correlation. There's no correlation between it. So, the takeaway, I guess, is don't waste any effort in the name of learning styles. Just develop good, sound lesson plans, and don't worry so much about the particular learning styles that are out there. And again, you can get yourself in a little bit of trouble here if you're trying to over accommodate for the various learning styles. Let me go ahead. And I guess what I mean by that is, like, for example, if I add closed captions here, what I'm doing here is, okay, I'm giving you another way to view the information, right? But also what I'm doing is I'm increasing your cognitive load. So if you're trying to address, the visual learner, the auditory learner, and all these different things, what you can do is actually build up too much into your presentations, increase cognitive load, and ultimately, your students will overwhelm. So that's the first myth. The other one is media panaceas. And again, this idea that one particular technology is a better way to transfer knowledge. And so basically the takeaway here, and the Army did studies where they took the same content and they did various modalities, movies, live classrooms, various things like that, and found that the amount of measured learning with each of the modalities was the same. And so I guess the takeaway to me is that technology as a tool doesn't trump basic instructional design. And when I always mentored like young instructors, I always said, hey, you don't want to change what you're doing in the regular classroom. When people were transferring to online, I was like, treat that webcam like it's just a student. Stick with what's been effective for you in a live classroom will also be effective for you in the mentored learning classroom. The third myth that they talked about in the book, the more they like it, the more they learn. So there's a very small correlation between how well you score on your evals and how much your students actually learn. The evals are much more an evaluation of what they thought of the particular class. I guess I kind of flip this around though. For me, it's like I've never been someone who's very concerned with surveys or evaluation scores and things like that. I feel like those things just take care of themselves if you do your job. But, but the way I look at it is students will give you higher evaluations if they learn more in your particular class. So focus on creating value, focus on actually bringing, getting that knowledge transfer. And the more you teach your students, ultimately the better off you're going to do on your evaluation. Myth number 4, learners know what they need. So this is one of the reasons things like mentored learning absolutely didn't do so well. It's a good idea as a concept or something that, hey, we're gonna put you in charge of your learning plan. But the reality is your students just don't make good instructional decisions. I think from a takeaway standpoint, I would just say, keep your class structured. Don't give your students lots of options. And then one of the other things, we have a tendency to, like move our labs to the end of class. Say, all right, well, we're going to spend the last 3 hours doing labs instead of interjecting them at the appropriate time based off of the topic. And I get the motivation on that, but in reality, from a learning standpoint, that's probably not a really good idea because students won't make good decisions. If you move all the labs to the end of class, then more students, a higher percentage of your students will never do the labs. And that's just reality, right? They're at the end of the day, they got work to go back to, they got to go pick up their kid from school. So just think about, where you place your labs in terms of, and not trying to move everything to the end of the day just because you feel like it's a convenience. The fifth myth, active engagement is essential to learning. So basically, as people, we have a limited amount of ability to process things. And the book talks about how people are only capable of a limited amount of processing, and behavioral processing may limit psychological. So the idea, I guess, from a takeaway standpoint for me is, I try to demonstrate labs and try not to do much of the follow the leader type of walkthrough, because if they're having to click and move around and jump back and forth between screens, that's taking a lot of their behavioral processing, and that's going to take away from their psychological processing. They're not going to be able to learn as much because they're too busy, with these physical activities. So that's I guess would be the one takeaway I would have for that. And again, there's science behind all this. It's in the book, but I figured I'm going to have you guys just trust me. Just believe me on that. The second chapter talks a little bit about graphics. There's an additional section on graphics, but if we think about these 4 questions, do graphics improve learning? Are graphics effective for everyone? Does the type of graphics make a difference? And do learners like lessons with graphics? The first question, do graphics improve learning? And the answer is yes. And we'll talk more about this in a second here, but your memory has dual channels. You have a visual channel and you have an auditory channel. And so when you're learning, we can leverage the fact that you have those 2 channels to give you a larger cognitive load. So the short answer to do graphics improve learning is yes. The asterisk on that, it assumes the graphics are relevant. You can't just have pictures of anything, and you can't just make things colorful to improve learning, but there must be, some relevance there. The next question, are graphics effective for everyone? The answer here is yes, with a but. They become less effective with students with high levels of prior experience. And the reason for that, is because of our long-term memory, right? When I'm describing a situation to someone, if they have a lot of experience, if I'm describing a networking problem to a networking professional, I don't need to give them a picture because they can mentally draw that picture in their head. They can pull from their long-term memory, they can pull from patterns, and they can see it already. So the less experience someone has, the more valuable it is to give them a diagram. As people get more advanced in their knowledge set, drawing them a picture doesn't really help because they already have the capability of drawing that picture in their own head. Whoops, sorry about that. Let me get back in here. All right, types of graphics, do they make a difference? Again, the answer here is yes. You'll see that this diagram here on the left is much easier to read. There's a lot less extrinsic processing than what you see. So these are a couple different diagrams of the meiosis process. Again, the one on the left, easy to read. So line drawings, simple graphics are much more effective from a learning standpoint than detailed diagrams. And there's a lot of processing that's going to take my mind to actually get through these particular pictures. So simple diagrams, line art are perfect for in class. I keep hitting the wrong button. All right. Do learners like lessons with graphics? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. I don't know if this isn't necessarily a learning concept, right? This is more, I'm going to do well on my evals type of concept, but presentations that are visually appealing and engaging will increase your eval score. I guess the point I would make on that is you want to focus on, on the details. So look at your Adobe Connect environment, look at your background, look at your slide decks and things like that, and make sure that they have a certain level of visual appeal. All right. All right. So the one thing I really did want to talk about, this was the third chapter in the book, and this idea of cognitive load, and three different concepts here. So we have working memory, long-term memory, and cognitive memory. And your working memory is your RAM, right? That's your active processor. That's where your thinking happens. That's where you're problem solving. That's where you're learning. And the big thing here is that it is highly limited, right? So they say like 3 to 5 chunks of information at any given time when someone is actively processing information. Now, on the plus side here, we have this, this dual channel here. So we can, by including visuals and then also using auditory, give people more information to work with. So that's important, I guess, in terms of planning your lessons, to make sure that you're capitalizing on both of those, both the auditory working memory and then also the visual working memory that they would have. Problem is I've got two my escape keys bound to 2 different things, so getting a little weirdness here. All right, so long-term memory is you have a huge capacity for long-term memory. You store these various patterns. Now, the big takeaway here, I think, is not so much about your students, because we don't necessarily get a chance to influence our students' prior learning, but your long-term memory and how you present material. So what happens is that the better your skill set, the more you can do without thinking about it, right? And so when I'm doing a demonstration, or when you're doing a demonstration, you'll use keyboard shortcuts and things like that. You'll use acronyms. You'll multitask. You'll be doing 2 things at the same time to try and speed up the demonstration. And the reality is that's not putting any cognitive load on you, because you already know how to do all these things. And so you're just pulling this from long-term memory, very minimal cognitive load. On the student side, you're overflowing the student with cognitive load. So I guess just think about that, right? Again, the greater your skills, the more risk there is that you're going to be working in a way that your students won't understand. So, before you execute a keyboard shortcut, say what you're going to do. I'm going to use Windows E to bring up Windows Explorer, or whatever it may be. Try to not multitask in your demos, 1 step at a time, follow a pattern, avoid too many acronyms that might overload the student. But again, this isn't so much about what our students know as it is being aware of what we know and our skill set and how that can impede our ability to transfer knowledge. Everybody's been in a situation where they've had a subject matter expert try to teach them something and not been able to follow, right? So, and it's because, right, they're pulling from their long-term memory and they're overflowing your cognitive load at the time. So keep an eye on that. And then lastly, the cognitive load theory. So 3 things here: intrinsic, extraneous, and germane. The intrinsic is just the complexity of our instructional goal. So something like a simple vocabulary lesson or something like that, we don't have to worry about overloading our students. But when you get into something like a variable length subnetting, there's going to be a high level of complexity there. And so we have to manage, the cognitive load. So, I always talk about, using like a scaffolding approach. So if I'm going to teach variable length subnetting, the first thing maybe we'll do IP. And then I'll try to cement that gain, right, with some sort of knowledge check or quizzing. And then from there, we'll move on to, binary. And then I'll try to cement that particular gain. And then from there, I'll move on to just basic subnetting. And then finally, to cap off the lesson, variable length subnet masking, right? But think about, what your instructional goal is, and then think about the complexity of it, and then think about, how you can logically get, from A to B in manageable chunks for the student. Now, also, the other big thing here, to me, is this extraneous cognitive load. So this is the work that does not contribute to learning. Okay, and this is what we want to minimize at all costs. And so when you think about it from your student's perspective, and what can you do to minimize extraneous load? I'll give you guys some examples. So, students spend a lot of time trying to capture screenshots and things like that when we're lecturing and things like that. I just completely take that off the table. I use Zoom It, and what I do is I just take a screenshot of everything that I annotate, and then I put it into a PDF file, and then give it to my students download it after class. So, again, I don't want my students wasting time capturing screenshots and wasting energy, cognitive load on that extraneous activity. If you look at like labs on demand or something like that, there's a lot of extraneous load potentially in this particular interface. And so I spend a lot of time, if I have an LOD type class, really teaching my students how to dial in the interface, how to show the content in a separate window, various things like that you can do to try to help things out from a visual standpoint. But again, I think that's time well spent, because when they're in the lab environment, I don't want them worrying too much about scroll bars and bouncing around back and forth and those types of things. I also do that with Adobe Connect. I always start my class, I take a screenshot of Connect. I got one right here, and then I go through and I detail everything. Hey, this is the recording button, this is the meter, chat is a tabbed interface. I go through all of that with my students, and because I don't want them having to figure out the interface. I don't want them to have to waste energy extraneously dealing with and fighting with the Adobe Connect interface. So I do spend a lot of time in the beginning of my class really outlining Adobe Connect and how it works. And then also when I have LODs, when I first introduce the labs, I spend a ton of time with that. And so like screenshots, courseware, just think about how your class environment looks from your students' standpoint, and how much time do they have to spend switching between screens, scrolling, doing various things that don't contribute to their learning in any way. It's just extra work that we put on them, and again, that takes away from their ability to focus on learning goals. So our goal, right, is germane cognitive load. That's everything that we do that engagement that aligns to the learning goals. And so that can be obviously our demos, our lectures, visuals, polls, quizzing, various things like that. But that's where the good stuff happens, right? That's where they learn. And the less extraneous cognitive load they have, the more germane cognitive load will be there. So one of my favorite comments always when I look at my comments for my classes is that Ralph taught the class at a good pace. And what that means is, at least for that particular student, that I did a really good job of managing the cognitive load, that they didn't get overwhelmed. And we've all been in that situation where we're trying to knock out 3 chapters on a Friday afternoon. And we know that we're not really teaching our students anything, right? And this is why, right? We are just overflowing. They don't have any cognitive load for it. We're just going through the motions. So, that's one of my favorite comments that when I read my comments is the class was taught at a good pace, because again, that means that a lot of learning occurred, in that particular class. So anyway, interesting read, very much. I know I had a limited amount of time to talk about things, and certainly I'll take questions here at the end. If anybody has any, I guess I would just close saying that, it's a good idea, to educate and make, data-driven decisions in your class. And, that's sometimes information that you'll collect from interaction with your students, but also information that you can collect from various materials that you read. I guess my other recommendation personally is that you be bold, that you try new things in the classroom. It says keep what works and discard what doesn't. The big thing is don't be afraid to fail. From my standpoint, I'm always trying new things in the classroom. Hey, let me do this demo this way. I fall on my face all the time in the classroom, right? I kind of feel like if I don't fail at some point in time in my class once a week, I'm not working hard enough. I'm just not trying. So I guess Mario Andretti, the race car driver, had a saying. What did he say? He said, if everything's under control, you're not going fast enough. So, so that's kind of the way I go about things. It's like I'm always trying new things. I'm always trying to innovate. I'm always failing, but I'm always learning from those failures as well. So, and that goes to that last bullet, adopt a continuous improvement model to your practice. I mean, every day I walk into the classroom, my one goal is to get a little bit better at my job. And you're not going to do that unless you're innovating, trying new things, and, seeing what works. And hey, always love to talk about this stuff. Got my emails there. So absolutely feel free to contact me at any time about anything. And then I'll give the author a little love. So Bruce Clark, Evidence-Based Training Methods, awesome book. And questions? Let's go there. I know I kind of rushed through a little bit because I felt a little limited on time. Some of you guys probably got to get back at 1 o'clock. So
thank you, Ralph, so much. I think it was great. I see a lot of comments. I would also say any comments, because it's definitely a specific vision, right, that you shared that was listed in this book. So I would be curious also to see if there's any comments to some of the things you mentioned.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I felt that the book was reaffirming in a lot of ways, that there was science behind like decisions that I had kind of come to on my own as a trainer through experience. But definitely it's a good read. It will improve your practice for sure. And, that's just the first 3 chapters. I mean, so if people liked it, I can keep going. I mean, not today, but I mean, as we go forward, maybe every other month or whatever, I can continue to talk about some of the science behind, how people learn. So I'm more than willing to do that.
Yeah, thank you for offering. I would also like to see if there's anyone else that has, now with you paving the path and sharing your, this presentation and giving us this insight and summary. Maybe someone else has read something that you want to share, or something similar to what Ralph did. Any thoughts or ideas?
You can learn from anything, for sure.
Sounds like a lot of volunteers, huh?
Yeah, right. I guess we'll get chapter 4, 5, and 6 next.
Yeah, let's give it some thought, and we don't need to decide now, but give some input, share in email any thoughts of when we could schedule a next session, or if there are any ideas for other sessions. I know Tynan is setting up the meeting also to give some updates from an operational standpoint. So I'm waiting for a date for that. Annie, actually, do you know if there's a date set for that already?
No, there's not a date yet. And hi, okay, everyone.
Hey, Annie, how are you?
I'm fantastic. I hope all of you are too. Hi, Dolores.
Scott, I like that.
Eric Brockway, I'm going to be hunting you down later this afternoon for 20 minutes.
What do I do this time?
I'm home. 20 minutes of Crystal Reports time.
Oh, okay.
I need you. So did each of you get the